What happens when a sports debate stops being about football and starts feeling personal? Because that's exactly what Cleveland is watching unfold right now. A routine quarterback discussion has turned into one of the most uncomfortable media clashes Browns fans have seen in years, and it all centers around one explosive statement that set everything on fire. When Jason Lloyd publicly suggested the Browns should cut Shedeur Sanders, it wasn't just another hot take. It was a line-crossing moment. Cutting a player isn't criticism. It's a declaration. It's saying someone has no place, no future, and no value to an organization. And for many fans, that's when the conversation stopped being fair. What made things even more volatile was the response. Carman didn't tiptoe around it. He didn't soften his words. He came out swinging, openly calling out Lloyd and questioning whether emotion, frustration, and online backlash had replaced objective analysis. And when a respected media voice turns on a colleague this directly, people notice. This wasn't framed as friendly disagreement. This was Carman essentially asking, why are we doing this? Why does personal dislike suddenly justify demanding a player's removal? Why does criticism escalate into something far more extreme the moment fan pushback enters the picture? And that's what makes this situation so fascinating and so uncomfortable. Because the argument isn't really about arm strength, reads, or mechanics anymore. It's about power, it's about responsibility, and it's about whether a media member crossed from analysis into targeting. Cleveland fans have seen quarterback chaos before. They've seen narratives derail careers, and now they're watching two voices collide over something much bigger than a depth chart. Because once the word cut enters the conversation, there's no taking it back. And what happened next only made this divide even deeper. This situation didn't explode slowly. It detonated the moment one phrase hit the airwaves. When Jason Lloyd suggested that the Cleveland Browns should cut Shedeur Sanders, the reaction wasn't mixed, it was immediate and hostile. Because in NFL language, calling for a player to be cut isn't analysis. It's a verdict. It's not he needs work or he's not ready yet. It's saying this player has no place in the organization at all. That's why the response from Carman hit so hard. Carman didn't treat Lloyd's comment like a spicy take or a normal sports argument. He treated it like a professional failure. On air, he made it clear this wasn't something you casually toss out because you're tired of the conversation, tired of the fan backlash, or tired of defending your stance online. Calling for someone to be cut, Carman argued, carries real weight, reputationally, professionally, and emotionally. And that's what changed the tone instantly. This stopped being a disagreement about quarterback evaluation and turned into a confrontation about intent. Carman openly questioned why Lloyd went there in the first place. Was it about football, or was it frustration? Was it about performance, or was it about dealing with a loud, aggressive fan base that pushes back every time Sanders' name comes up? Those questions mattered because Carman wasn't whispering them. He was saying them publicly, forcefully, and without walking anything back. What made this moment so explosive is that Carman didn't frame Lloyd as wrong. He framed him as reckless. He suggested Lloyd had crossed from critique into something personal, and that distinction changed everything. Fans didn't hear this as media-on-media bickering. They heard someone finally saying out loud what many of them had been feeling for weeks. Once Carman drew that line, there was no neutral ground left. Either Lloyd's comments were fair football analysis, or they were driven by emotion and ego, and the fan base picked a side fast. Because in Cleveland, where quarterback turmoil is practically generational trauma, words like cut him don't land softly, they land like threats. And that's why this moment didn't fade after one show. It lit the fuse for everything that followed. Before the backlash, before the on-air confrontation, and before this turned into a full-blown Cleveland media war, Jason Lloyd had already made his position very clear. In his view, Shedeur Sanders simply wasn't the answer at quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. And at first, that stance didn't raise many eyebrows. Questioning a young quarterback is normal. Skepticism comes with the position. Browns fans, more than anyone, understand that. But it was what Lloyd said that started to rub people the wrong way. It was how he said it. From the beginning, Lloyd wasn't cautiously critical or open-ended in his evaluation. He sounded convinced. There was no room for development, no patience for growth, no acknowledgement that young quarterbacks often struggle before they stabilize. His tone suggested the verdict was already in and Sanders had already failed. Fans noticed that immediately. Lloyd focused heavily on what Sanders supposedly couldn't do. He questioned his ability to throw into tight windows. He argued that Sanders didn't throw receivers open. He dismissed the idea that Sanders could grow into the role. On the surface, these are football critiques. Analysts say things like this all the time, but many listeners felt something else underneath it, a sharpness that didn't feel purely analytical. That perception grew stronger when Sanders had a rough outing midseason. Lloyd seized on that performance as confirmation, not as a data point, not as a bad day, as proof. To fans, it felt like Lloyd had been waiting for a stumble so he could say, "See, this is exactly what I've been telling you." And here, where the tension really started to build, Lloyd's criticism didn't soften after that game, it hardened. Instead of framing Sanders as a work in progress, he framed him as a mistake. And that framing matters, especially in a city that has watched quarterbacks get written off over and over again. Fans weren't upset because Lloyd didn't believe in Sanders. They were upset because it felt like Lloyd never intended to. The analysis felt less like evaluation and more like dismissal. And once that perception set in, every comment that followed was filtered through it. That's when the pushback began. And that pushback would eventually turn this from a football debate into something far more personal. Because once people believe a media member has already made up their mind, everything they say afterward gets questioned. For a moment, it looked like the story had already been writ. After weeks of criticism and doubt, Shedeur Sanders entered a game where the pressure couldn't have been higher. Every throw mattered, every mistake would be magnified. And for Jason Lloyd, this felt like the opportunity to finally validate everything he'd been saying. Early on, the expectations were low, the narrative was already set. Sanders wasn't the guy, he didn't see the field well enough. He couldn't make the difficult throws, he wasn't built to succeed at this level. One more shaky performance would have locked that perception in for good. But that's not what happened. Instead, Sanders delivered the kind of performance that forces people to pause. He was calm. He was decisive. He moved the offense efficiently and made throws that critics said he couldn't make. Not flashy for the sake of flash, but controlled, confident football. The kind that doesn't scream superstar but absolutely demands respect. For fans, this was the moment everything shifted. The same people who had been told Sanders couldn't handle pressure watched him respond to it. The same criticisms that had been repeated for weeks suddenly didn't line up with what was happening on the field. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. And in football, progress matters. That's why this game hit differently. Because it didn't just contradict the criticism, it challenged the certainty behind it. When someone is adamant that a player has no future, even one strong performance creates tension. It forces a choice, reassess, or double down. And for many watching, it felt like Lloyd had to swallow a hard pill. The performance didn't erase Sanders' flaws, but it proved something important: that the door wasn't closed, that development was possible, that the evaluation wasn't finished. Fans expected that moment to cool things down. They thought maybe the conversation would shift, maybe the tone would soften, maybe there would be some acknowledgement that Sanders had answered the bell when it mattered. But instead of easing the debate, this game quietly set the stage for what came next. Because when a player delivers under scrutiny and the criticism doesn't change, people stop questioning the player and start questioning the critic. And that's exactly what began to happen here. This performance didn't end the controversy. It sharpened it. And what followed would push the situation far beyond normal football debate. This is where the conversation took a sharp turn and where many fans felt something changed. After Shedeur Sanders delivered a performance that clearly showed growth, most people expected the analysis to adjust, even slightly. Not praise, not a victory lap, just acknowledgement that development was happening. But instead of recalibrating, the criticism shifted in a very different direction. Rather than focusing on outcomes, Jason Lloyd began zooming in on increasingly granular details. It wasn't just about missed reads anymore. It wasn't just about timing or decision-making. Suddenly, the conversation moved into posture, protection calls, and hyper-specific mechanics that most fans rarely hear discussed at this level. On their own, those critiques aren't illegitimate. Quarterback play is complex and details matter, but the pattern is what caught people's attention. Every positive moment seemed to be met with a new negative qualifier. If Sanders executed well, the response wasn't progress, it was still doesn't know what he's looking at. If the offense moved efficiently, the conversation pivoted to what he supposedly wasn't doing before the snap. To many listeners, it felt less like film study and more like searching for anything that would justify the original conclusion. That's where the tone became the issue. Fans started asking why the goalposts kept moving. Why did the criticism feel endless even when the results improved? Why did it seem like Sanders had to be perfect just to be considered passable? Those questions grew louder as the language around him became sharper and more absolute. And this is where perception matters as much as reality. Whether Lloyd intended it or not, the coverage began to feel like confirmation hunting. The idea that Sanders wasn't the guy appeared locked in, and everything afterward was filtered through that lens. When that happens, even valid critiques lose credibility because the audience no longer trusts the motive behind them. For a fan base that has lived through endless quarterback turnover, this struck a nerve. Browns supporters have seen players written off early before. They've watched narratives harden before careers ever had time to breathe. And now, many felt like they were watching it happen again, not from coaches or executives, but from the media. That's why the backlash intensified here. It wasn't about disagreement anymore, it was about fairness, about whether analysis had crossed into persistence, and about whether a young quarterback was being evaluated honestly or simply being held to an impossible standard because the conclusion had already been decided. Once fans reached that point, the trust was gone. And without trust, every word that followed only made the divide deeper. By this point, the conversation had moved far beyond box scores and film breakdowns. What took over next was something every modern sports debate eventually runs into: the feedback loop. As Jason Lloyd continued doubling down on his criticism of Shedeur Sanders, the reaction from fans grew louder, harsher, and more personal. Social media lit up after every comment. Threads spiraled, mentions flooded in, and it stopped being a one-way critique and turned into a constant back and forth. This is where things got messy. From the outside, it started to look like a cycle that fed itself. Lloyd criticized Sanders. Sanders' supporters fired back aggressively. Lloyd responded by sharpening his tone even further, and each time that happened, the backlash intensified. What might have started as football disagreement turned into something emotional on both sides. According to Carman, this was the turning point. Carman suggested that Lloyd's comments no longer sounded like they were driven purely by evaluation but by frustration, not with Sanders as a quarterback but with the reaction that came every time Sanders was criticized. It's important to frame this carefully. There's no proof that Lloyd changed his stance because of fan pressure, but many observers believe the tone shift lined up too cleanly with the backlash to ignore. The more pushback Lloyd received, the more extreme his language became, and that perception mattered just as much as intent. For Browns fans, this struck a nerve. Cleveland's fan base is famously defensive, especially at quarterback. Years of instability have made supporters hyper-aware of narratives they believe can derail players before they're given a real chance. So when Lloyd's criticism began to sound less patient and more dismissive, fans didn't just disagree, they took it personally. That's when accusations of bias started flying. Fans questioned whether Lloyd simply didn't like Sanders. Others argued he was reacting emotionally to being challenged online. And once those ideas took hold, everything Lloyd said was viewed through that lens, fair or not. This is the danger zone for media figures. When the audience starts believing a take is fueled by ego or irritation instead of analysis, credibility erodes fast. And once that erosion begins, even reasonable points get dismissed. That's exactly what Carman warned about, that Lloyd was letting the noise shape the narrative instead of staying above it. At that stage, the debate wasn't about Sanders anymore. It was about whether a media member had allowed the crowd to pull him into the fight, and whether crossing that line changed everything that followed. This is where Carman stopped dancing around the issue and made his position unmistakably clear. Carman wasn't interested in debating whether Shedeur Sanders was elite, average, or still developing. To him, that conversation had already been hijacked. What mattered now was something far bigger, the responsibility that comes with having a platform. And in Carman's view, Jason Lloyd had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed casually or emotionally. Carman's argument was simple but cutting. Disliking a player is not grounds for demanding his removal. Getting attacked online is not grounds for demanding his removal. Being annoyed by a fan base is definitely not grounds for demanding his removal. Those things might make coverage uncomfortable, but they don't justify calling for someone to lose their job. That's where Carman drew the boundary. He reminded listeners that the Cleveland Browns don't belong to the media. They don't belong to columnists, radio hosts, or analysts. They belong to the organization and the fans. Media members are there to analyze, critique, and question, not to act as if they have authority over personnel decisions driven by personal frustration. And then Carman laid out the only scenario where calling for a player to be cut would make sense. If Sanders were a locker room problem, if he were selfish, if he were disruptive, if he were dragging the team down behind the scenes. In that case, Carman said, cutting ties would be understandable. But by every available account, Sanders was the opposite: a professional, a worker, someone teammates respected, someone trying to grow into the role, not tear the team apart. That distinction mattered. Carman wasn't defending Sanders as untouchable. He wasn't saying criticism should stop. He was saying the language mattered. Because when a media member calls for a player to be cut without evidence of real harm to the team, it stops being analysis and starts becoming personal judgment. And that's why Carman didn't soften his tone. He made it clear that Lloyd's comments weren't just wrong, they were irresponsible. He framed them as emotional overreach, driven by irritation rather than football logic. And when Carman said Lloyd had lost his mind, it wasn't meant as an insult. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when objectivity slips. A warning about ego creeping into analysis. And a warning that once media credibility cracks, it doesn't repair easily. For many fans, this was the moment everything crystallized. This wasn't about choosing sides between two media personalities. It was about defending a line that, once crossed, changes the entire conversation. Once the noise settled, this situation stopped being just another Cleveland sports controversy. It turned into something much larger, a conversation about power, influence, and responsibility in modern sports media. At the center of it all is a simple but uncomfortable question: where is the line between criticism and targeting? Media members are paid to analyze, challenge, and question players. No one disputes that. But when criticism becomes repetitive, absolute, and emotionally charged, it starts to shape narratives in ways that go beyond football. And that's exactly what many fans believe happened here. When Ken Carman pushed back against Jason Lloyd, he wasn't just defending Shedeur Sanders. He was challenging the idea that media voices can escalate rhetoric without consequence. Because when someone with a large platform repeatedly frames a player as a problem, that perception doesn't stay contained to talk radio or columns. It bleeds into fan discourse, locker room narratives, and even front office pressure. That's where ethics come into play. A media member doesn't need to like a player. They don't need to believe in their future, but they do have an obligation to separate evaluation from emotion. Once personal frustration, ego, or audience reaction starts influencing coverage, the analysis loses its foundation. And when that happens, credibility becomes the casualty. This debate also exposes a modern reality that didn't exist decades ago: constant fan access. Social media has erased distance between analysts and audiences. Every take is immediately challenged, every opinion is tested. And while that doesn't excuse harassment, it does create a new pressure point, one that can tempt media figures to dig in instead of reassess. Carman's argument suggests that resisting that temptation is part of the job. Because once coverage becomes reactive, it stops serving the audience, it stops serving the team, and it stops serving the truth. At that point, the story isn't about wins, losses, or development anymore. It's about conflict, and conflict gets clicks. That's why this moment resonated so strongly with Browns fans. They didn't just see a player being criticized. They saw a reminder of how quickly narratives can harden, how easily young quarterbacks can be labeled, and how difficult it is to escape once that label sticks. In a city shaped by quarterback instability, that fear is deeply ingrained. This situation forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sports media doesn't just reflect conversations, it directs them. And when that power isn't handled carefully, the damage lasts longer than any season. By the time all the segments aired and the reactions poured in, it was clear this situation had outgrown a simple disagreement. What started as quarterback analysis turned into a case study on how media influence works, and what happens when that influence isn't handled carefully. This was never just about whether Shedeur Sanders is a franchise quarterback or a work in progress. Reasonable people can disagree on that. The real issue was the escalation, the shift from critique to condemnation, the moment when language stopped evaluating performance and started questioning whether a player even deserved a place in the league. That's why Carman stepping in mattered so much. His pushback wasn't emotional defense of a player. It was a reminder of boundaries, a reminder that words carry weight, especially when they come from voices people trust. Calling for a player to be cut isn't just an opinion, it's a statement that can follow that player far beyond one season or one city. For Lloyd, this moment became about more than being right or wrong. It became about perception. Once fans believed emotion and frustration were driving the coverage, the credibility gap widened fast. And in media, perception is reality. When audiences stop trusting intent, even valid analysis gets ignored. Cleveland fans understand this better than most. They've watched quarterbacks come and go. They've seen narratives form early and stick permanently. They've seen patience disappear before development had a chance. So when this situation unfolded, it tapped into something deeper than fandom, it tapped into exhaustion. That's why the reaction was so intense. This wasn't fans demanding blind loyalty. It was fans demanding fairness, demanding that criticism stay grounded in football instead of drifting into personal frustration, demanding that media figures recognize the difference between challenging a player and trying to push them out of the picture. And this conversation doesn't end with one radio show or one columnist. It raises questions every sports fan should think about. How much power should media voices have over narratives? When does accountability turn into targeting? And who decides when a line has been crossed? Because sports talk shapes careers. It shapes fan perception. And sometimes it shapes reality itself. That's why this mattered. Not because two media personalities clashed, but because it exposed how fragile the line between analysis and influence really is. And once that line is crossed, there's no pretending it was just talk.